So I think that you would likely agree that recently there has been one tragedy or trauma after another, whether horrific natural disasters, national policy traumas, or violent human tragedies. Every few days, it seems, it's something new and awful. These tragedies and traumas can lead to many feelings: shock, distress, exhaustion, depression, guilt, overwhelm, indifference. This may be due to something called disaster fatigue. When prolonged exposure to news coverage of disasters or political change antithetical to our values leads potential volunteers to lose motivation. This disaster fatigue is closely related to compassion fatigue, a psychological condition commonly found in caregiving and direct relief professions that is characterized by withdrawal, isolation, and a sense of apathy or helplessness. For people who have naturally strong feelings of empathy, the sheer volume of bad news can have a cumulative effect. The continual images, repetitive stories, and graphic video we see and hear every day are increasing our levels of compassion fatigue. We may think that we can handle it, that we are desensitized, but we're not. It turns out that human beings are not designed to process an unlimited amount of trauma. Instead, we are wired to protect ourselves from it. Seeing so much disaster, hate, and divisiveness, and feeling unable to do anything about it leads to a kind of moral distress. When we experience so many policy changes in opposition to our Unitarian Universalist values, we can feel overwhelmed, unsure of which issue to engage, or how to take action that makes a difference. And this is compounded by the fact that working on justice issues in Arizona, and since January 2017 at the national level, it's a long-term commitment. There are no quick victories right now. Laura Moser understands the long game approach. She developed a phone app after Inauguration Day called Daily Action, which breaks down the bad news of the day into manageable steps. Call your congressman, sign this petition, support this fundraiser. And the service had 250,000 signups when it first started, but the registration has tapered off some. She says it's hard to keep that same level of indignation to sustain the effort. She calls it resistance fatigue. Ariana Huffington, HuffPost founder and CEO of Thrive Global e-newsletter, talks about outrage. She asks, have you heard the latest outrage? Can you believe what the administration just did? I'm not actually talking about anything specific, she says, but between the time I'm writing this and the time you're hearing it, there will be plenty of examples. Your inbox and notifications are likely full of them. And you may well be talking about them at dinner tonight before settling in to watch outraged pundits rehash them. And there's one last check for late-breaking outrages before a night of restless, fitful sleep. In the morning, with a check on the accumulation of whatever new outrages rain down overnight, the cycle starts all over again. And all humor aside, she goes on to say, this is no way to live. We are exhausted by it, and that's not healthy. When we live in an ongoing state of outrage, anxiety, fear, and stress, it wreaks an awful toll on our physical and mental health. It's not sustainable, and there is another way. It's not that the outrage is unwarranted. Any president's actions have real consequences in real people's lives. During the Obama administration, for instance, more migrants were deported than in any previous administration. This is high stakes, and it really matters. But that is precisely why we have to take back control of how we react. Because only then will we be able to mitigate the effects on the lives of people most vulnerable to them. So, Huffington says, we need to go back to the truth that helped the country recover after 9/11. She says, if we are consumed by fear, the terrorists win. If we are in a perpetual state of outrage, no one wins. Because when we become depleted and exhausted and zapped of our energy, we are not as resourceful, creative, or effective. Because after all, the goal of any true resistance is to affect outcomes, not just to vent. So whether it's called resistance fatigue, disaster fatigue, compassion fatigue, or chronic outrage, you likely recognize the symptoms. So the questions become, how can we sustain ourselves as we resist divisiveness and hate, and not slip into stereotyping the other political party, whichever it may be? How can we stay strong for the struggle against policies that affront our values and impact vulnerable communities? How can we effectively deal with the tragedies, traumas, and outrage that we face? How can we remain resilient? Well, according to Wikipedia, which of course knows everything, psychological resilience is defined by an individual's ability to successfully adapt to life tasks in the face of social disadvantage or highly adverse conditions. Adversity and stress can come in the shape of family or relationship worries, health problems, or workplace or financial worries, among others. Resilience is that ability to bounce back from a negative experience with competent functioning. Resilience is not a rare ability. In reality, it is found in the average individual, and it can be learned and developed by virtually anyone. Resilience should be considered a process rather than a trait to be had. It is a process of individuation with gradual discovery of one's own personal and unique abilities. A common misconception is that resilient people are free from negative emotions or thoughts and remain optimistic in all or mostly all situations. To the contrary, resilient individuals have, through time, developed proper coping techniques that allow them to effectively and relatively easily navigate around or through crises. In other words, people who demonstrate resilience are people with optimistic attitude and positive emotionality, and are, through practice, able to effectively balance negative and emotions with positive ones. So, what are some of these coping techniques or effective practices that we can learn? First off, how about scaling back on that bad news overload? I think it was back in the 1990s when Dr. Andrew Weil was suggesting a news break, and it still resonates today. Now, everyone's news break looks a little bit different from a total blackout, but trust me, whenever I've tried a total blackout, there is always someone around to tell me what has happened that I need to know. So it can be from a total blackout to just scaling back the number of times one listens to or reads news reports over the day. Because after all, nonstop coverage is how the news media works in 2018. But limiting the exposure to the apocalyptic trifecta of internet, cable news, and social media is a way to maintain a store of productive, not guilt-inducing empathy. I mean, how many times do we need to hear a horrific story or look at graphic video footage to get the point? Once is probably sufficient. There is no need to beat ourselves up with repetitive news, even if it comes from different sources. Instead of burying ourselves in the news, we can take care of ourselves so that we can take care of others. Self-care is as individual as we are. We can take care of ourselves to strengthen our resilience by getting enough sleep, exercising, enjoying nature, eating healthy foods, taking breaks from technology, cultivating our sense of humor. Do you hear your mother speaking? The list is endless. Hiking is my personal spiritual practice because it gets me out into the beauty of nature and gets my body moving. It really clears my head, lifts my spirit, and gives me perspective. But you can read a book, take a yoga class, run around the block, cook a delicious pasta dish, grow something beautiful or yummy in your garden. Whatever it is, do that activity that leaves you feeling rested, relaxed, renewed, and rejuvenated. Now, self-care, especially when we're talking about helping others who really are in dire straits, is an enormous privilege, even if it's just to prioritize a morning walk. But the truth is, in order to do the work, we must take care of the instrument. So I commend self-care to you. Now, it's also helpful to ground ourselves in our values and our Unitarian Universalist faith. It's important to know who we are and what we stand for. So think, what in your life calls you to work on a specific issue, whether it's mass incarceration or gun control, immigration or economic justice, education or the environment? What is your story? So many injustices call out to us, but no one has time to address them all. So think, what issue calls you to action? What do you stand for? Reverend Jennifer Kwong, who's one of our Pacific Western Regional staff people, tells us, they say faith without work is dead. So I worked for equality next to my queer friends who wanted to get married. And I worked for religious freedom next to my Muslim friends who were accused of being terrorists. And I worked for racial justice next to my black friends whose lives were affected by police brutality. Yet I didn't feel fully alive, he says, even after working myself to death, until I let my work become a spiritual practice. Until I let go of my attachment to the outcome, until I stopped chasing after political issues, one after another. I still believe faith without works is dead, but works without faith is just as lifeless. Another way to develop resiliency is to find a community of support. Connect with people who know you, love you, agree with you, and support you. Find that feeling of solidarity. Join others in your congregation working on the same issue. Join a UU Jazz Issues Action Team. Take part in a campaign with others who see the need. Reach out to people. Seek out encouragement and inspiration from friends. And be there for those who need the same. Engage in small group ministry to process your experiences together. And finally, gratitude, faith, and hope lead to more resilience. Developing a daily gratitude practice, giving voice to the thankfulness we feel for our own lives, leads to that hopeful attitude and positive emotionality that helps us grow our ability to effectively balance negative emotions with positive ones. And have faith. Trust what Unitarian minister Theodore Parker said that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. pronounced more succinctly. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And keep hope alive. Notice the small steps in a positive direction. Celebrate the times when negative policies are not passed and consider what author Rebecca Solnit says about hope. She says, hope locates itself in the premises where we don't know what will happen. And in that spaciousness of uncertainty, there is room to act. When you recognize uncertainty, you may recognize that you may be able to influence the outcomes. You alone, or you in concert with a few dozen or several million others. Hope is an embrace of the unknown and the unknowable, an alternative to the certainty of both optimists and pessimists, because optimists tend to think that it will all be fine without our involvement. Pessimists take the opposite position. Both excuse themselves from acting. She says, it is the belief that what we do matters, even though how and when it may matter, who or what it may impact, are not things that we can know beforehand. We may not, in fact, know afterwards either. But they matter all the same, and history is full of people whose influence was most powerful after they were gone. So we cannot let ourselves slip into the mindsets of either optimists or pessimists. To truly engage hope, we must take action. And there are so many ways to do it. We can educate others about the issues. We can organize others to work with us on a campaign. We can provide service or supplies to vulnerable members of our community. We can march or witness or write to bring attention to injustice. Or we can work for policies to get at the root of the problem. These days, deciding how to act is like trying to sip from a fire hose. The number of needs can feel overwhelming. To help limit that, we can commit to one small action per day if we're on Laura Moser's daily action alert. Or we can read our own Ann Schneider's Arizona Legislative Alert to select one way to take meaningful action this week. Try looking to what you can do to affect one little part of the future so that you aren't buried in the overwhelm of the present. How can you use the things that you are really good at to engage the causes that you really care about and improve a community's ability to survive? Remember that justice building is a slow process, and we are in it for the long haul. Remember, too, that we have been given the agency and the power to make a difference. So if we limit the bad news overload, take time to care for ourselves, ground our justice work in our values and Unitarian Universalist faith, find supportive communities, and remember that truth and justice ultimately win, we will become more resilient and better able to face the challenges before us with compassion, and once again, take meaningful action. May we make it so through our living.